10:25 a.m. on June 4, 1942, within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers would blaze into ruin. But to see how it comes to this, we have to step back to May 27th. On that day, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato as wind whipped the flags and waves hammered the hull. The empire, drawn across maps, appeared unstoppable. In just half a year, Japan had seized Singapore, overrun the Philippines, taken the Dutch East Indies, and raised its flag from Burma to the Aleutians. Tokyo reveled in triumph, but Yamamoto, inside the Naval High Command, weighed the cost. Excitement ran high as Operations Chief Kame Kuroshima urged one more decisive strike. An overwhelming blow meant to break American spirit and force peace on Japan's terms. The planners leaned over maps, drawing arrows as if destiny itself obeyed their pens. Success, repeated so often, began to feel like a law of nature. That dangerous illusion had a name: victory disease, the arrogance of a long winning streak, the blindness that comes from mistaking momentum for certainty. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Pearl Harbor's architects, dismissed Americans as soft and too individualistic to endure a prolonged sea war. Confidence hardened into dogma, and disagreement became heresy. Yamamoto knew better. His years in the United States showed him the immense potential hidden behind American politeness. Shipyards that could turn rivers into factories, industries that could churn out steel in endless supply. He had warned before, Japan might dominate. For 6 months, but beyond that, his faith faltered. Now those 6 months had passed, yet the fleet sailed with mathematical precision. The plan called for a feint toward the Aleutians, while the main strike captured Midway, a tiny atoll pointing the way to Hawaii. The assumption was simple. America would rush to defend, and there the Kido Butai, the deadliest carrier strike group on Earth, would crush them. On paper, flawless. In practice, built on fragile belief that the enemy would act as predicted, sluggish and timid. Yamamoto sensed the flaw. The fleet still thought like battleships, not carriers, and he would command. From far in the rear aboard Yamato, ensuring delays at critical moments. The plan demanded precision and obedience from a war that rarely gives either. Across the ocean, the giant Yamamoto feared was already stirring. American codebreakers were listening. Pearl Harbor's yards had turned wreckage into working ships, with astonishing speed. Even the battered Yorktown might yet return. None of this appeared in Japan's neat charts and polished briefings. That was victory disease at work. It blinds victors to anything that doesn't fit the story of inevitable success. Outwardly, Yamamoto looked like a man steering toward a crowning achievement. But inside, he felt the chill of doubt. Triumph had made Japan fragile. The strategy glittered, but it had been drawn up in euphoria. And when plans built in intoxication meet the resistance of reality, they burn. Japan's blueprint seemed immaculate. Lure America north with the Aleutians. Strike, then destroy them at Midway. Intelligence suggested the Americans had only 2 carriers left, Enterprise and Hornet. Yorktown, heavily damaged at Coral Sea, was believed useless for months. The entire scheme leaned on that assumption, treated as fact rather than guesswork. In Tokyo's war rooms, reports were interpreted as conclusions, not clues. Japan's Abespa, revised code JN-25, was assumed unbreakable, and confidence rolled into certainty. Meanwhile, in a cramped basement at Pearl Harbor called Station Hypo, a different war unfolded. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his crypt analysts sifted through endless scraps of coded fragments, piecing them into meaning. The Japanese kept referring to a target called AF. Washington feared AF might mean Hawaii itself, but Rochefort argued it was Midway. To prove it, he staged a ruse. Midway broadcast an open message about a broken desalination plant and a shortage of drinking water. Soon after, an intercepted Japanese signal confirmed it, AF was short on water. AF was Midway. With that, the plan snapped into clarity. Admiral Nimitz moved instantly. Enterprise and Hornet sailed, and Yorktown, barely repaired, was rushed, out of dock the moment it could float. He ordered the carriers to a hidden square of sea northeast of Midway, Point Luck, where they could wait unseen for the enemy. Now the tables turned. Japan thought it was baiting a trap, but America had already read the script and rearranged the stage. The Kido Butai expected to provoke a response. Instead, the response was already waiting, patient and silent. Decks, crammed with bombers whose crews knew details Japan thought secure. Codes alone don't sink ships, but they bend fortune, tilting uncertainty in your favor. By the time Japanese bombs began pounding Midway, another contest was already tipping against them. Tokyo's admirals still believed Yorktown was finished, but Pearl Harbor's shipyards had made the impossible real. After Coral Sea, reports claimed Yorktown was wrecked, bombed through the deck, fires, structural damage. Estimates said months of repair. Tokyo accepted that number because it suited their view of American weakness. Within days, Yorktown limped into Pearl, and without pause, welders, electricians, riggers, and fitters swarmed aboard. They patched holes, braced bulkheads, rewired circuits, sealed damaged compartments. It wasn't flawless, but it only needed to launch planes and fight. 72 hours later, the carrier steamed out, paint still wet, to rejoin the fleet. America now had 3 carriers. Japan never corrected its intelligence. Scouting flights over Hawaii had lapsed, considered too risky and unnecessary. Silence was mistaken for certainty. The real failure wasn't just a missing ship, it was a culture that filtered information until only comforting facts remained. Analysts told superiors what they wanted to hear, while inconvenient fragments were set aside. Victory disease narrowed vision until doubt itself disappeared. Out at sea, Yorktown's crew drilled over the scars of repair, adapting to a ship. Still wounded but functional. Pilots memorized the quirks of patched systems, knowing a small hitch could cost lives in combat. The carrier's very presence shouted a message: damage does not equal defeat. And that reality would soon collide with Japanese assumptions, as battle plans built for 2 American decks suddenly faced 3. Everything turns upon a single wrong figure, a miscalculation so small it hides in plain sight. Yet in carrier warfare, even the smallest number can set off a chain of consequences that no fleet can escape. On the neat charts hanging in Tokyo's war rooms, Yorktown exists only as a dotted silhouette, a question deferred to some distant future. In the real Pacific, though, that supposed ghost is carving a foaming wake toward a patch of sea Admiral Nimitz has named Point Luck. The Americans are about to stretch their reach farther than the Japanese planners believe remotely possible. What Tokyo dismisses as absence has become presence. What they treat as a phantom now sails with real steel and guns. A fleet may disregard what it cannot see, but it can never outrun what is already moving to confront it. In late May, the anchorage at Hashirajima is alive with thunder and motion. For days, ships have been gathering until the water is choked. With gray hulls, the greatest battle fleet the Empire has ever launched. Over 160 vessels press against the sea lanes, 11 battleships, 8 fleet carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, transports loaded with troops and supplies. At the center stand the 4 most dangerous ships afloat, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor, their decks stacked with more than 200 aircraft and seasoned crews who have so far fought without suffering real defeat. From a distant vantage point, the Armada seems like destiny itself made visible, a machine too vast to resist. Yet closer inspection reveals strain, for this enormous force is spread across thousands of miles. A northern group steams toward the Aleutians to stage a diversion. Invasion transports crawl toward Midway with protective escorts, covering forces patrol nearby waters, And far behind, at the outer edge of radio range, Yamamoto himself sits on the giant battleship Yamato, intending to oversee the decisive clash from a position that all but guarantees delay. On paper, this dispersion promises cunning surprise. In practice, it ensures scattered timing and fractured awareness. Orders must leapfrog across the void through signals and codes, arriving always a beat too late. The Japanese plan sparkles with exactness. Every arrow marked with a schedule, every unit assigned a lane of advance. Midway will be softened, then seized. American carriers will dash forward to save it and be met by the Kido Butai, which will erase them on ground chosen by Japan. It is elegant, detailed, even beautiful in theory. But beauty on paper is a dangerous thing. The plan says nothing of what to do if the enemy refuses to behave as expected. When predictions are mistaken for certainty, reality itself becomes the most dangerous opponent. Doctrine deepens the weakness. Japanese naval thought still imagines carriers not as agile knife fighters in a swirling duel, but as extensions of a staged, set-piece battle. Coordination is rigid, adaptability scarce. Decisions flow from a distant center, but carrier combat demands instinct in seconds, not directives carried by signal flags across hundreds of miles. In such a war, minutes are currency, and this system spends them wastefully by design. Reconnaissance, the lifeblood of carrier operations, is spread thin. Search arcs for float planes are narrow and late. A critical scout from the cruiser tone is delayed on the very morning clarity will matter most, leaving a hole exactly where visibility is needed. Submarine picket lines meant to detect American departures from Pearl are placed too far east, and too late to matter. In an ambush, blindness is fatal, and Japan sails half blind. On the other side of the ocean, Nimitz seizes upon the gaps. With the insights of his codebreakers, he places Enterprise and Hornet under Raymond Spruance and the battered Yorktown under Frank Jack Fletcher in a square of ocean northeast of Midway, Point Luck, an empty patch of sea invisible to Japanese. Charts. Their mission is brutally simple. Stay hidden. Let the Japanese exhaust their first strikes on Midway itself, then fall upon their carriers when their decks are exposed and vulnerable, aircraft away and fuel lines stretched. America has fewer ships, but they possess two quiet advantages Japan does not suspect: knowledge and placement. On the horizon of early June, two visions advance toward collision. One is a grand narrative that assumes the enemy will obediently step where it is told. The other is a leaner script that waits, listens, and strikes the instant opportunity appears. The water between Midway and Point Luck will decide which belief survives contact. Aircraft crews ready their machines, scouts fuel on catwalks, radios hum with coded chatter. One side trusts a cipher thought unbreakable, the other has been quietly reading those signals for weeks. The stage is set. Before dawn on June 4th, carrier decks glow dimly under shielded lamps. Crews run fuel hoses, arm bombs, test controls, chalk wings, and tail surfaces. At 4:30, Nagumo gives the signal. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu swing into the wind and fling 108 aircraft into the darkness, dive bombers, level bombers, fighters, all arrowed toward Midway. Their instructions are simple. Cripple the island's defenses. Then, if needed, finish it with a second wave. The sea is calm, the sky gentle. Confidence rides with the strike eastward. But Midway is not caught off guard. A Catalina flying boat gropes through the morning haze, glimpses the fleet, and radios a warning. On the atoll, Marines dash to their battered buffaloes and wildcats. Ground crews slam ammunition belts into guns. Anti-aircraft gunners crouch behind weapons, nerves taut but resolute. They know they are outnumbered, yet every man intends to sting the invader. At 6:30, the Japanese. Assault erupts from the sun. Sky and sea dissolve into chaos. Tracers streak, flak blossoms, zeros carve down through the defenders. Marines fall in desperate bursts, but their sacrifice shreds the perfect geometry of the attack. Bombs rip runways, ignite fuel dumps, churn sand and fire into the sky. Midway burns, yet Midway breathes still. The airfield is scarred but operational, its guns still stabbing upward. Tominaga, leading the strike, reads the message written in smoke. The island is wounded, not silenced. He radios the truth. Midway requires another blow. That plain signal collides with a plan that never anticipated such a choice. The reserve aircraft are staged for naval battle, already fitted with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. To redirect them means dragging them below, stripping ship-killing loads, hauling up land attack explosives, then winching everything topside again. Japanese practice insists decks be cleared for launches and recoveries, so refueling and rearming happen below, amid fuel lines and bomb carts. Efficient when the sequence runs smoothly, perilous when it must be altered. Nagumo now confronts a brutal dilemma unwritten in the elegant plan. Keep the reserves armed for ships and risk leaving Midway alive to strike back, or rearm for land attack and risk carriers clogged with bombs and gasoline precisely when an unexpected enemy might appear. The plan assumes that enemy is far off, at Pearl and Yorktown incapable of sailing. On Midway, observers count planes departing, then count fewer returning, many nearly out of fuel and ammunition. Over the fleet, the returning strike circles helplessly, gauges sinking as they await clearance. Below them, the hangars have become a storm of confusion. Torpedoes rolled aside, fuel vapors thick in the air, men shouting for space. Every passing minute sees elevators jammed, hoses snaking across decks, aircraft stacked in the sky above. Tominaga's call for a second strike has turned the Japanese carriers into floating powder kegs, just as the possibility of surprise grows most dangerous. Nagumo's choice is easy to name but agonizing to solve. He has one flight deck and two wars to fight. The reserve force already armed for ships must be transformed for land attack. At 7:28 a.m., the order goes out. Crews descend into frenzy, unfastening torpedoes, pushing them aside, dragging up fragmentation bombs, stringing hoses, uncoiling lines. The system was designed for perfect rhythm. Under pressure, it becomes chaos. Above, the first wave aircraft orbit desperately, their tanks draining. Below, the carriers are being turned into magazines of fire. The decisive battle Japan craved is forming, but not in the shape they intended. Each minute lost is a match hovering near powder. Beneath the decks, ordnance handlers rushed among crates and trolleys stacked with bombs and torpedoes, their hands and eyes frantic as every action now meant sacrificing precious minutes needed elsewhere. In that suspended tension, news suddenly arrived by radio. An aircraft delayed on its scouting run had finally made contact. American ships had been spotted, their presence confirmed beyond doubt, and worse, among them was a carrier. That single detail rewrote everything. The process of arming planes for strikes on Midway's runways was no longer useful. If American carriers were near, then Japanese carriers could not waste their decks preparing to bomb sand and airstrips. They had to be configured to kill warships before those warships killed them. Orders screamed through the corridors and hangars to reverse the preparations. Bombs being hoisted up were rushed back down. Torpedoes sent to the holds were dragged back up again. Ordnance crews fumbled with fuses, unscrewing, swapping, and reinstalling with sweat dripping down their foreheads. Fuel lines hissed under pressure as hoses were reconnected. Elevators creaked and slammed as they carried fresh loads with no allowance for error. Above them, the returning strike from Midway was limping home with fuel nearly gone, pilots circling and demanding an open deck to land. Delay meant those men would be forced to ditch their planes in the sea. The careful rotation of a planned carrier cycle had broken down entirely. Now it was triage, improvisation under impossible pressure. In American doctrine, arming and fueling often occurred directly on the flight deck in emergencies, accepting the chance of disaster for the benefit of speed. Japanese doctrine preferred the opposite. Everything handled below decks, sacrificing tempo for safety and cleanliness. But that choice, made years earlier, became lethal when hangars were crowded with half-fueled planes, exposed munitions, and fumes gathering like invisible dynamite. In such a space, time itself was explosive, and every wasted second shortened. Survival. Admiral Nagumo's plan had assumed he could move step by step, finish destroying Midway, then calmly turn against the American fleet. Reality shattered that sequence. He was now being forced to prepare for two incompatible battles at once, and whichever he chose exposed his force to ruin from the other. If he prepared for the island, he risked being caught with hangars full and decks unusable. If he armed for the sea, Midway's surviving planes could keep hitting his task force and split his defensive fighters. By the time the first Japanese planes returning from Midway slammed onto their decks, the carriers were packed in a way no officer had imagined. Aircraft stacked overhead waiting to land, elevators jammed, hangars crammed with weapons in mid-change. An exhausted fighter pilot stretched thin after constant intercepts. The Americans were no longer distant shadows. They were near, closing fast, and the moment for a clean strike had already slipped away. Japan had come expecting a perfectly timed, decisive battle, but what they now faced was chaos measured in seconds. At that very moment, three American carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, launched their torpedo squadrons. The planes were old devastators, slow and fragile, relics by 1942, but their crews carried unshakable resolve. They approached in small, scattered groups with no proper escort, flying low and straight, knowing they would face the full fury of Japanese defenses. At 9:20 in the morning, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet made contact. Before launch, their commander, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, had warned his men that no matter how many fell, even one surviving aircraft must carry the attack to its end. Over the sea west of Midway, that grim oath turned into fate. Japanese Zeros fell like predators. From the sky, their cannons shredding through wings and cockpits. Explosions blossomed into the sea as planes cartwheeled into white spray. Still, the Americans pressed closer, holding their line long enough to release torpedoes, though almost none would strike true. One by one, the squadron was annihilated, until only Ensign George Gay remained alive to witness the destruction. Enterprise and Yorktown squadrons soon followed into the same slaughter, their outdated aircraft cut apart by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Torpedoes, when dropped, ran poorly or were easily evaded by Japanese carriers twisting violently. Through the waves, nearly every American torpedo bomber was destroyed. From Japanese bridges, the sight looked like triumph. Reckless attackers obliterated, carriers unhurt, defenders supreme. Officers allowed themselves a moment of relief. But what they could not see was the trap unfolding. The American sacrifice had forced the Japanese combat air patrol to drop low, burning fuel and scattering after stragglers. Their carriers, weaving wildly, could not organize a counterstrike. Decks were still crammed with half-armed planes, ordnance scattered, returning aircraft begging for space to land. The neat cycle of launch and recovery was in tatters. The doomed torpedo runs had not destroyed the enemy with weapons, but with disruption, tearing vital minutes from their schedule and pulling fighters away from the skies above. Into that fractured moment came the second act, the dive bombers. High above the ocean, fuel nearly gone, American dive bomber squadrons searched desperately for the Japanese carriers. Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's group, faced a decision. Turn back with nearly empty tanks or gamble on instinct. Spotting the destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin its fleet after hunting a submarine, he followed its wake. The gamble revealed the prize. 3 Japanese carriers spread across the ocean, exposed and vulnerable. Fighters were still drawn low by earlier attacks. Decks were disorganized, hangars filled with bombs and fuel. It was the perfect instant. McCluskey signaled, and the dauntless squadrons broke into attack. Bombers rolled from the sun, plunging in steep dives. In the confusion of target selection, many lined up on Kaga, while Richard Best of Bombing 6 pulled two wingmen toward Akagi. The dives screamed downwards, sighting crosses fixed on wooden decks. Explosions ripped across Kaga, igniting parked planes and turning the ship into a furnace. Best's bomb on Akagi struck near an elevator, igniting armed aircraft below and sending fire racing through compartments. Almost simultaneously, Yorktown's group struck Soryu, hammering her flight deck and hangars with clean hits. Within minutes, all three carriers were doomed. Japanese officers looked up in disbelief, realizing the consequences of their earlier choices. Their fighters were too low, their evasive turns too late, their damage control overwhelmed as fires roared beyond containment. Once proud ships, the core of the striking force, were burning wrecks. What had begun as a carefully scripted battle collapsed into sudden catastrophe. The gamble for decisive victory had instead opened Japan's heart to ruin, and the minutes bought with American blood had been enough to turn the tide of the Pacific. The signal flags that once directed movement across the fleet falter and hang, confused in the smoke. Radio channels, once meant for coordination, choke with overlapping voices, some barking commands, others crying for help until words blur into noise. The neat rhythm of the morning, launching planes, recovering them, and sending them off again, shatters into chaos as crews fight desperately to stop steel from softening and bending under the inferno of fire and bomb blasts. At about 10:25, the first explosions tear into decks, and by 10:30, the entire fate of the engagement has shifted. In just a handful of minutes, carriers that had once been the sharp edge of Japan's naval power are reduced to gutted hulks adrift in smoke. The trap carefully prepared for the Americans has sprung back on its creators, unleashed by something as small as the wake of a single destroyer, and kept open by the sacrifice of squadrons that dragged enemy fighters low, snarled their timing, and left decks cluttered at the worst possible moment. Above the rising smoke, American dauntless dive bombers pull out and head for home with fuel gauges trembling on the edge of empty. Below them, three of Japan's great carriers burn, forming a deadly triangle of flame and oil spreading wider with every minute. Out of all the fleet carriers present, only one remains capable of continuing the fight. The morning's disaster has not ended. It is shifting into something far more personal. On the bridge of Akagi, the air itself tastes of burning oil and metal shavings. The ship jolts violently, not once but several times, as secondary explosions rip through her lower decks. Officers stare in stunned silence through shattered windows at a flight deck now boiling with fire. For a frozen moment, no one moves, no one speaks. Then the paralysis shatters. Teams rush for hoses, men claw at tangled flags, aides turn desperately toward Admiral Nagumo, waiting for orders that never come. He stands stiff, transfixed by the destruction consuming his flagship. Only when Captain Aoki takes him by the arm and nearly drags him away is Nagumo removed from the wreck, transferred to a cruiser where he can technically continue to command. The mastermind behind Pearl Harbor now flees through burning debris, carried away in a small launch, while the fleet he shaped crumbles around him. Only Hiryu still has a clean deck and the ability to strike back. Aboard her, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi wastes no words on despair. He rallies his remaining air crews, fuels the dive bombers that can still fly, and orders them into the sky at once. Guided by rough bearings and a radio net that already feels unreliable, they fly low and hard until they sight Yorktown. The American carrier, freshly repaired and still smelling of new paint over old scars, absorbs 3 bomb strikes in rapid succession. Fire surges along her superstructure, smoke pours into the sky, and for a moment she appears doomed. Yet hoses stretch across her deck, repair crews vanish into the heat, and within an hour the ship drags herself back into the fight, still launching planes, still moving forward. Yamaguchi refuses to allow that survival. He scrapes together a second strike, this time with torpedo bombers, and hurls them straight into the jaws of American fighters and walls of anti-aircraft fire. The cost is brutal, but 2 torpedoes smash into Yorktown's side, knocking out her power and leaving her dead in the water. The order to abandon ship follows. Men lower boats, slide into the sea, and watch the carrier that cheated fate finally yield. Days later, a submarine will send her to the bottom, but for now, Midway's battle has no patience for conclusions. It surges onward. American scouts stitch together spot reports and calculate where the final Japanese carrier must be. By afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and the battered Yorktown rise high until the ocean looks like a flat blue plate below. When they roll over and descend, Hiryu's lookouts see them too late. Bombs tear through her decks, explode in hangars filled with vapor and fuel, and rip compartments wide open. Within minutes, Hiryu, too, is mortally struck. Damage control fights on, but pumps lose ground. Flames rage hotter, and decks glow with unbearable heat. Yamaguchi refuses evacuation. He chooses to remain aboard with his captain, going down in an echo of an older warrior's code. Messages race westward to Yamato, where Admiral Yamamoto receives them like hammer blows. Akagi aflame, Kaga destroyed, Soryu sunk, Hiryu lost. The invasion fleet turns back. Submarines shift patrol lines that no longer matter. The decisive battle Yamamoto sought has come, but it has not taken the shape he imagined. And already the result is beyond doubt. Night falls over oil slicks, lifeboats, and burning wrecks. 3 carriers lie as glowing tombs in the water, one more slowly dying beside them. Japan had hoped to end a war here with victory. Instead, it found silence, a silence no announcement could disguise. 4 carriers gone, hundreds of planes destroyed, and more critical than steel, the loss of Japan's corps of veteran aviators, pilots and leaders trained through years of unforgiving discipline. Numbers on paper say more than 100 airmen are gone, but reality says an entire living system collapsed in one day. Japan's training pipeline was designed to produce the very best for limited wars of choice. It was never built to replace dozens of veterans at once, while scaling up for a continental struggle against an enemy that built planes as easily as cars. Across the ocean, American factories already roar with assembly lines, and training schools flood the sky with thousands of new pilots. The edge of skill that once belonged to Japan begins to level, then tilt hard in America's favor. The Japanese government responds not with truth, but with a story. A communique on June 10th announces victory, boasting of American carriers sunk, while admitting almost nothing of their own losses. Survivors are hidden, letters filtered, families left in the dark. Even within the palace, the truth seeps only in fragments. The intent is clear. Protect morale, keep factories working, preserve the empire's image, but the cost is high. A nation that cannot face a defeat cannot adapt to prevent the next. At sea, the math takes over. With 4 decks gone, air groups gutted, and fewer resources to patrol a vast ocean, the initiative, the choice of where and when to fight, passes to the Americans. What follows is not another Midway, but an unending pressure. Convoys harassed, outposts cut off, replacements forced to learn while fighting an enemy who grows stronger by the month. Within the Navy, the search for scapegoats begins, but the reasons named, late scouting, poor orders, fighters, drawn too low are details, not causes. The real failure lies deeper. Early triumphs bred overconfidence. Doctrine became rigid, assumptions hardened into blinders, and leaders punished doubt when doubt was the only shield against disaster. Yamamoto, who had long feared the limits of Japan's early victories, now faces the future he dreaded. He must defend an empire with fewer carriers, fewer veterans, and an opponent who reads signals faster than he can send them. In his private notes, he concedes what he cannot say aloud. The high tide has been reached. From here, the waters recede. Midway did not just sink ships, it consumed time. Time to train, to innovate, to recover mistakes, time Japan no longer had. Courage, ingenuity, and ships yet to be built remain, but without the calendar to wield them effectively. The silence in Tokyo is not only mourning, it is recognition. A war meant to end quickly has become one Japan may only endure. Midway overturned an entire worldview. The formula of shock and speed yielding surrender dissolved in fire and smoke. Intelligence, not firepower alone, rewrote the outcome. A ruse about fresh water, a chance sighting in open seas, a carrier repaired in days rather than months, each proved that America could adapt, produce, and strike back with relentless rhythm. In 5 minutes, Japan's aura of inevitability shattered, replaced by hard lessons. Assumptions kill when they replace flexibility. Carrier warfare is a contest of minutes, and wasted minutes are lost victories. And perhaps most of all, ships can be rebuilt. But generations of elite airmen cannot. Midway burned through Japan's irreplaceable core, leaving emptiness that courage alone could not fill. From that day forward, momentum crossed the ocean. 2 months later, Marines waded ashore on Guadalcanal, beginning a slow grind of endurance. Intelligence continued to pay dividends. Radio traffic decoded, positions inferred, ambushes staged. A year later, American fighters intercepted and killed Yamamoto himself, using knowledge ripped from signals. In 1944, the Marianas Turkey, "Shoot!" confirmed the verdict in the skies, as inexperienced Japanese pilots faced swarms of trained American aviators flying from an endless stream of new carriers. The line from Midway's burning decks to the collapse of Japan was not straight, but it was unbroken. Midway revealed truths greater than tactics. Flexibility beats symmetry. Humility outlasts bravado. Systems that welcome bad news, however painful, outlive those that bury it. A basement full of cryptanalysts, scribbling notes in plain words, outperformed conference rooms rehearsing certainty. A plan built to absorb failure is stronger than a plan that demands perfection. Yet none of this erases the human cost. The torpedo, squadrons that died drawing fighters down, the Japanese sailors who fought hopeless fires, they were not victims of cowardice, but of the misplaced confidence of leaders above them. Midway's clarity is brutal because it was purchased with heat, smoke, and blood. Stand at that horizon at 10:30 in the morning, when the flames roared loudest, and beneath the chaos you can still hear something quieter. The snap of history, breaking, the moment when an empire that thought victory was a habit, learned that time keeps its own clock, and that in 5